Yo, what up, Night Nation? This is Alan, and you're tuned in to another episode of the UCF Football Updates podcast. It's been a little while since I've done kind of an official podcast, but I wanted to really do a 2022 season recap. I know I did a post about it, but you can only write so many words in there, and I know it's been a couple months, but it gives me time to digest, and I've been very busy, so but still want to address the season. It's not that far in our rearview mirror, so I think it's still worth having a discussion. Obviously, a lot of things are going on in UCF world with moving to the Big 12, officially getting the schedule. So we're kind of moving past the AAC, putting that in our rear view and moving on to bigger and better things. But I still think this season was an interesting one to talk about. Entering the season, we talked about this being a fairly hyped up season. Year two of the Gus Malzahn era, had some great momentum going into year two after beating UF in the bowl game. There was a lot of excitement going into this year with the transfers, the QB battle, everything that was going on. It was setting a tone to be a special year. There was a lot of talk about UCF, getting back to the American Championship, winning the American Championship in their last season in the conference, and then possibly going to the New Year's Six Bowl. It felt like all the pieces were in place to do that. The thing that we all talked about prior to the season was who would be the quarterback, and that would ultimately be the difference maker. And as we saw, it was a difference maker. When JRP officially won the job, there was a lot of talk that his teammates felt that Mikey Keene had actually won the position, but ultimately, and he looked better in practice. Ultimately, Gus chose JRP because of what he envisioned the offense, how it could be. Even though, he had seen him in practice, he felt in games he would be the better selection. So, things get off to a strong start, obviously, against South Carolina State. UCF absolutely rocks them 56-10, FCS opponent. And, Plumlee looks good. He throws for 308 passing yards, rushes for another 100, has seemingly a good connection with Javon Baker, who kind of looked real good in that game, had 84 yards and a touchdown. But then the very following week, a Friday night game against Louisville at home. This is the game where was really the first testing point for UCF. It was at home. We had lost to Louisville last year on the road. And it felt like, this is a game we need to get revenge on them. And this game right here, obviously, I had hope after this game, but this game right here showed me we still had some of the same chinks in our armor. This game showed me right here that this was going to be a potentially inconsistent year. I really felt after that, I was like, wow, that when we struggled to score at all in that game, second half, didn't score at all, had touchdowns taken back. It felt like a repeat of the previous year when we had, our losses in 2021. It was an exact carbon copy. The offense stalled out. The passing game couldn't get going. The defense started to tire out. And it was that right there set up kind of a tone for the season. It was a 20-14 loss. The offense was abysmal. And that's where you really started to see, JRP maybe, there's a reason why he was transitioned to wide receiver at Ole Miss. He only had 131 yards in the air, had an interception, no touchdowns, and basically relied on his legs, had 83 yards, but he could not get the Knights moving on offense. And, there was a lot of things thrown out that game. The offensive line was bad. Played horrible really in that game. There was TDs called back, yada, yada, yada. But it really set the tone for the season. UCF would ultimately rebound and win their next four, blow out FAU, beat Georgia Tech handily, but same thing in that Georgia Tech game. It took until the end of the third quarter for UCF to score a touchdown. They went on a drought over like a quarter and a half. And you saw, again, Plumlee had 49 passing yards in that game. There was a lot of worry that, that was going to continue throughout the season. The Knights at that point were 3-1, but you didn't feel good about it. Then they beat SMU, a close game at half, and they absolutely explode in the second half and destroy them 41-19, where then in that game, Plumlee started to look real good. He had 316 passing yards, 20 of 29, and threw for 2 touchdowns and looked really, really good doing it. And then you see that and you're like, okay, all right, maybe he's starting to put the pieces together. And then we go back home and absolutely destroy Temple 70-13. Plumlee ties a program record in the history of UCF's program with 7 total touchdowns, 373 yards in the air. Was absolutely electric. And UCF throws up 70 points. We win 70-13. So at this point, we're 4-1. And Plumlee's put together back-to-back really, really strong games, including tying a long-standing record for a UCF quarterback. So now you're feeling good. Now it's like, okay, maybe that's 2 games in a row. We have something brewing here. The Knights are 4-1, obviously had not lost in conference yet. Win their first 2 conference games or 2-0, sitting at top of the standings. You're feeling real good. Then the ECU game happens. We go on the road, and those same things that we saw from Plumlee happen again. He throws some very bad, untimely interceptions. The offense stalls out, and UCF only scores 13 points in the game. They lose 34-13, big time setback. So now, the Knights sit at 5-2, 2-1 in the conference, and now we have Cincinnati coming to town that very next week, number 20 in the country. And you're not feeling confident at this point. Night Nation was not feeling confident. I remember all of the news headlines. I remember all of the forums. People were nervous. They were calling for, Mikey Keene to come in, saying Plumlee wasn't the guy. Then this story comes out that ECU had Gus fired a guy that had a connection to ECU. They hired him. And there was apparently, the guy was telling the ECU coaching staff what our plays were. So they, basically they knew what was coming, and which is why UCF lost the game. So you kind of get an excuse, a pass, if that story is to be believed, if it is actually true. But regardless, you're still worried about, we're basically at that point through the season, over halfway through the season. And at that point, it's been very inconsistent play from Plumlee. So you don't know. Do you see, is it the Temple Plumlee we want? Or that's the true Plumlee, or is it the ECU Plumlee? Is it the Louisville Plumlee? So we're going into this Cincinnati game, and there's a lot on the table. The winner of this essentially controls their fate, their destiny inside the conference. And I was at that game. That was one of the most electric home games in quite some time for UCF. And remember, to this point, and I had harped on this for a while, UCF had not had a big monumental win in 3 years. The last big win was the 2018 AAC championship. We're talking about being a ranked team, talking about being a team that's well over 500 or at the top of the conference. They hadn't done that in quite some time. So this Cincy game mean a lot. Also, Cincy had 3 straight wins against us. So we hadn't beaten them since 2018. Had some heartbreaking losses in 2019. 2020, and then get absolutely obliterated by them in 2021. So we needed this one. And what happens in this game? JRP through the first half was playing good. He was playing good, but it was a very defensive game. Through halftime, the lead was 10-6 for UCF. So there was really only 1 touchdown, which was an RJ Harvey touchdown. And this was also the RJ Harvey breakout game. And Plumlee was actually to that point playing okay. It wasn't like he was throwing turnovers or anything like that. But the offense, at that point had scored 10 points, right? And they didn't score a single point in the second quarter. They got shut out. But Plumlee was 7 for 11, so he was doing okay. But then he gets injured, and Mikey Keene comes in for the first time all year. And he really had a historic, I would say, maybe not historic, but one of the more memorable saving grace moments in at least recent UCF history. This guy comes in cold, hasn't played obviously all season, been on the bench all year, obviously in upsetting manner, losing his starting gig. And he comes in, goes 15 of 21, throws 176 yards, 0 turnovers, didn't throw a touchdown, but he led 2 massive touchdown drives in the fourth quarter, mind you. So if you recall that game, man, it was exciting. So like I said, UCF's up 10-6 at half. We get a safety in the middle of the third quarter, but then Cincinnati ends the third quarter with a touchdown, takes a 13-12 lead. Pretty much, it's 13-12 throughout the most of the fourth quarter. Then with about 4 minutes to go, Isaiah Bowser punches one in on a Mikey Keene led touchdown drive. UCF is up a very narrow 5 points, and Cincy responds on the very next drive with a 40-yard touchdown run of their own. They take a 3-point lead, so you're nervous at that point. There's less than 3 minutes to go in the ball game. Cincy has a 3-point lead. And what happens? Mikey Keene does it again. He leads us, on a 7-play, 75-yard drive, and it ends with the RJ Harvey touchdown, which was the kind of the iconic spin move that he had to get into the end zone. And UCF ultimately takes that 25-21 lead with 48 seconds to go and closes out the game. So a huge win. The crowd goes wild. UCF knocks off a ranked opponent for the first time in 3 years. And now, UCF is sitting at 6-2 and 3-1 in the conference. And you're feeling after that game really good. But what happens is this sets up a QB controversy from that moment on, because Mikey Keene played so well in that game. You're like, what do you do here? Obviously JRP wasn't benched due to performance. It was an injury, but it was kind of weird. So then we have Memphis on the road next week. JRP is declared out after all week. We're not knowing what's going to happen. And Mikey Keene gets the start again. And UCF pulls off a huge narrow road win at Memphis, 35-28, where Keene looks good again. He throws for 219 yards and really leads UCF to that win. And it was, then now you're like, okay, he's 2-0, has two of the biggest wins of the season. What do you do? So then comes the Tulane game. At this point, Tulane is number 17 in the country. They had only lost one game to this point, and we're going on the road. And you hear, Gus all week isn't really giving an indication of who's going to be the starter. But as we learned, obviously, JRP gets back and becomes a starter. And that ended up being, as controversial was, the right decision. JRP absolutely torched the Green Wave on the road. They had only lost one game. They were ranked, like I said. And right off the bat, you saw it. JRP had some massive runs right in the first quarter on the first two drives. On the second drive of the game, JRP took off for a 67-yard touchdown run. Looked absolutely phenomenal in the game. And it was clearly, the right decision to start JRP. Had outside of the Tulane game, the Temple game had probably his second best game of the season. Throws for 132 yards and a touchdown, but his athleticism was on full display. The things that we saw at Ole Miss against LSU, he was dynamic. He had 176 rushing yards for 2 touchdowns, had 2 really long touchdown runs, looked absolutely dynamic in the game. And UCF, holds on for a 38-31 win and gets their second ranked win of the season. And that was really the best stretch of the season right there. That 3-game win streak of Cincy, Memphis, and Tulane, with 2 ranked wins over Cincy and Tulane, that put UCF at 8-2, 5-1 in the conference. That was by far the best stretch of the season. That was the best football I had seen from UCF since the 17-18 run, hands down. It was old school, not old school, but it was 17-18 like. The offense was really good, scoring over 30 points in 2 out of those 3 games. The defense held strong. The athletes, our skill players, were on full display, getting 2 ranked wins. And then at that point, UCF is a ranked team again. We are ranked. It had been a while, finally back in the top 25 and full control of the conference. We were 5-1, sitting at first place in the conference, absolutely in control. And everyone is high at this point. We are feeling amazing about the year, 8-2. And then it comes all tumbling down after that. We literally would only win 1 game the rest of the way, and we'd finish out the season 1-3. And it all started with that Navy game. Navy is our other Tulsa. They beat us last year. They beat us this year. They just cause teams problems with the way they play. That triple option, the run, UCF, they have our number. I am not a big believer in, have a number, but they do. UCF could not figure it out. That game was an absolute mess. The offense stalling out, JRP doing the JRP of Louisville, the JRP of ECU. When we lose, he's not playing good. He usually doesn't play good in the losses. And UCF ultimately loses that game 17-14. Gus tries to, and this is where Gus made a critical, I would say, error. I know he was trying to spark the offense, but he brings in Mikey Keene. So at this point now, remember, Mikey Keene, we pretty much knew Mikey Keene was going to transfer almost from week 1 of the season, as soon as he got, not named the starting quarterback. So we know the rule. You can only play 4 games. You can only play 4 games in the season and still keep your red shirt. The rumor, and as it turned out being true, he wanted to keep his red shirt. So he's played in 2 games at this point, Cincinnati and Memphis. Gus throws him in against Navy, and on the very first drive, he leads a touchdown drive. Now Gus is pigeonholed, has to keep him in the game. Didn't end up mattering. That was it. That was the last time UCF would score, and ultimately would drop at home to Navy 17-14. And that kind of put the season in a tailspin. UCF got lucky with the committee ranking UCF in the top 25 in the CFP committee, which basically meant there was a lot of speculation going back and forth. Could UCF still make it into not only the conference championship, but the New Year's Six Bowl? Amazingly enough, because of that ranking based on some crazy scenarios where there was a bunch of ties up at the top of the top of the conference, UCF, all they had to do was beat USF. They're in the conference championship. And then if they win that, they're in a New Year's Six Bowl. So when we finally figured out that all we had to do is beat USF, the season gets, back on track with the final game being the War and I-4. We basically were winning in. We're still feeling a little skeptical about that loss to Navy, but we know all of our goals are still right in front of us. And we get a massive lead against USF, and then JRP gets the hamstring injury that would ultimately really be the downfall of UCF season, was his injury, because that forced, we took a huge lead, 31-7, and USF comes marching back, and actually, gets a 2-point lead heading into the 4th. We're feeling real nervous. And what happens? Mikey Keene saves the day again. The way he finishes UCF career will always go down as one of the cooler moments in UCF history. A guy that everyone liked, got thrown in the fire as a freshman, loses his starting job. A lot of people feel bad for him. A lot of people thought he should have won it. A lot of people thought he earned it. And he comes in and saves 3 games for us, Memphis, USF, and Cincy. And obviously, the USF game, our final time playing them, final time as conference mates, our biggest rival, to come back and lead, the winning drive and just, win the 4th quarter in your final game as a Knight against your rival to make it to the conference championship. That's gives me goosebumps. That's a memorable moment. That is a really cool. That will go down in our history as one of the better UCF USF games, one of the better moments. He'll go down in the lore of UCF history of epic wins against the Bulls. Because if you recall, there's only been in our series against USF, there's only really been, about 2 to 3 close games. I think 3, and this is one of them. UCF wins 46-39, and obviously ends with the epic Alec Holler pass. Was he in bounds? Was he out of bounds? Catches it. And then we convert a 2-point conversion, and ultimately with 20 seconds to go, the game-winning drive, a game-winning catch by the tight end Alec Holler, epic win to beat the Bulls 46-39. So we beat USF, and that gets us into the conference championship. But no one's feeling good at this point. You're talking about back-to-back games against 2 horrible teams. Navy and South Florida had at that point, 4 combined wins, and UCF loses to 1 and needs a last-second drive to win by a touchdown against a 1 or 2 win USF, whatever they were, who fired their coach midseason. So at this point, you're not feeling good. And at this point, also, Mikey Keene has burned his red shirt. So, you're wondering, okay, well, now pretty much, is he gonna? He said after the in the press conference after the USF game that he would play, or he said let's do it, or something along those lines. But if you don't play him against Navy, you could bring them in against Tulane, which is obviously the more important game, right? That's the conference championship. But nonetheless, UCF makes it back to the conference championship. The first time since 2018, we're finally back. So that was a win in itself. Getting back to the title game, we got back, and that's ultimately was one of our big goals in the beginning of the season. But beating Tulane twice on the road in a row proved to be too much. Tulane was a great team this year. You got to hand it to them. They ended up 12-2, beat USC in the Cotton Bowl. UCF made it close in the game. But Tulane pretty much, I don't want to say dominated from start to finish, but they had control of the game from start to finish. It started off bad, and Plumlee was clearly still hampered. His hamstring ultimately was part of the downfall of the season, and also, Gus Malzahn's management of the quarterbacks. I don't think he should have played him against Navy because he could have came in this game. Instead, Plumlee had to leave, and you bring in Tommy Castellanos in the biggest game of the season. He clearly wasn't ready, right? UCF did, get back in with back-to-back touchdown drives in the fourth quarter. We're only down 3 with 9:48 to go, but Tulane ultimately, shut the door. Scored after we got within 3 points. That was it. That was the last that we would score. Tulane would go on to score 2 more touchdowns and ultimately win by 17 there and finish us off. And JRP was hampered. He could not use his legs at all in that game. He was not running whatsoever. And I think if he was able to run, if he was fully healthy, I don't see why we couldn't have won that game. Or if Mikey Keene could have come into that game, there's no reason why we couldn't have won that game. So it's, woulda, coulda, shoulda, but, the mismanagement or just the health, of JRP was the ultimate downfall. Now, people are going to say, should we have started Keene all year? I don't know. I still think we could have had some of those losses with or without Keene. He didn't win us the Navy game. Maybe without him, we don't win, the Memphis game or something like that. But it could have been a similar result. It could have been a 3 or 4 loss season, maybe instead of a 5 loss season. I don't know. I don't know how different the results have been because as much as Keene won us 3 games, JRP absolutely won us some games, especially the Tulane game. And I don't know. And I think against Tulane, that wasn't on JRP. It was on JRP being injured, but it wasn't on his performance. So I think we could have won that game. So, it's tough. You don't know. I don't necessarily think Gus made the wrong decision starting JRP, but I do think he made the wrong decision managing Mikey Keene's red shirts. I think anything could have happened there. So that will always be one of the biggest what ifs of this year. The quarterback controversy that really lasted the entire season, if you think about it. So ultimately that loss sent us, from going to the Cotton Bowl, which we could have if we won, to, the Military Bowl, where you get to place Duke, a Power 5 team. No one was really too excited about it. There wasn't a lot of hype going into that game. And ultimately it ended up being another typical UCF loss that was of, the very indicative of how the season was, like the type of losses they had against Louisville and ECU, a 30-13 blowout. UCF's offense couldn't get anything going all game. JRP could not get his run game going. The pass game wasn't great. He only had 182 yards. Bowser was the leading rusher at 39. Clearly, Plumlee was either still injured or just, was not using his legs, or he was getting shut down by the Duke defense, who did a good job. And, UCF fizzles out, losing 3 of their last 4 games. But that being said, I do feel like this season was a little bit more successful than last season. So last year we go 9-4, this year we go 9-5, but the wins over Cincy and Tulane, the national ranking, and the fact that we made it to the conference championship with a chance to go to the Cotton Bowl, that was everything we wanted. We wanted to be playing meaningful games in November and December, and we absolutely were. We haven't played a meaningful game in November, December since 2018. So as much as, last year's story is a good feel-good story, beating UF in the bowl, finishing on a real high note, whereas this year we finished more on a sour note, I'd actually take this season over last season, hands down. The top 25 ranking, getting back in the CFP ranking, getting national attention again, winning against 2 ranked opponents, ending the losing streak against Cincinnati, and making it to the conference championship. To me, those are all more tangible things that I really like and I think are bigger accomplishments. Obviously, it was a disappointing end at 9-5, not an amazing record, but back-to-back 9-win years is not something to be upset about. Obviously 7 straight winning seasons for UCF. or 6 straight winning seasons for UCF. And, good year. Again, I'm never going to say a 9-win year is a bad year, but it was a good year with a lot of disappointment about what could have been. We could have gotten College Game Day. If we don't lose to East Carolina, College Game Day is coming against Cincinnati. We don't lose to Navy, then we get to host Tulane in the conference championship. We don't lose the conference championship, we get to go to the Cotton Bowl. So we just had a season of just missed opportunities. I think that's the best way to define it. But some other things, that was a full kind of recap of the season. There's a lot of other storylines, the offensive play calling under Gus Malzahn, obviously the quarterback controversy, the defense starting out extremely strong. The defense, that was something I didn't really highlight, was really the big story at the beginning part of the season. They start the season by they didn't even allow over 20 points until the ECU loss. So to that point, though, the most they'd given up was 19. They were the number 1 red zone defense in the country for most of the year. But then the defense kind of started to tail off right around the first Tulane game. Then you saw some issues. They only gave up 17 against Navy, and they actually did play good in that game. But you saw the 28 given up against Memphis, the 31 given up against Tulane, the 39 given up against South Florida, 45 given up Tulane, and another 30 against Duke. They kind of fizzled out at the end of the year. But and the big thing of that was, let's start, I guess, with the defense. I'll just continue on this route. Was the secondary play. That was the biggest disappointment. Going into the year, you thought, we were real excited about it. We had the Kobe Perry transfer. Obviously, Devontae Brown was preseason, had a bunch of preseason awards. You were excited about a lot of the secondary that you thought could be a really, really special season for them. There was a lot of depth. A lot of these sophomores were turning into juniors who had good sophomore years, and you felt a lot of them were going to break out. Devod Wilson was all second team last year. Then you had Justin Hodges, you had Brandon Adams, who had a great freshman year. And then you had some of these freshmen that you thought could come in, like Nakai Martinez. You had Quadric Ballard. You had a bunch of guys in the secondary where you felt really good about it. But whether it was the defensive scheme from Coach Travis Williams, the secondary played real far back from their defenders and unfortunately gave up a lot of chunk plays. That was a big part of the season, whether that was Coach T. Will's fault or whatever the scheme. It did not work too well. They played great in the red zone, but the secondary overall was not good. There was, I think Kobe Perry, other than Kobe Perry and Devon Wilson, had some good games, but very few turnovers or interceptions. UCF had 6 interceptions the entire year. And quite a few of them were just on at the end of halves, catching something. There was not really too many key interceptions. Then the linebacker play again was shaky. You had the transfer. Well, first of all, Terrence Lewis really never played. And then you had Brandon Jennings, the transfer, who started out on the 2 deep and then ends up going redshirting, going to the practice squad. And, so we have Jeremiah Jean-Baptiste, who did play pretty lights out most of the year. He was our shining star. And Jason Johnson, great story, ends up being all conference first team after transferring from the FCS, and ends up leading the team in tackles with 129, has 2 sacks. And ends up being all conference first team. So he was great. And then Walter Yates was a really good story too. He was 3rd on the team in tackles, I believe. Had 1.5 sacks, had a fumble recovery. So he had a good year too. But overall, the linebacker play was shakier, but Jeremiah Jean-Baptiste, helped, anchor it as well as Jason Johnson. There just wasn't a lot of depth there. They were forced to play the freshman Cam Moore. They really had to kind of go in and really into their guys they weren't probably expecting to play, especially with T-Lou and Brandon Jennings not working out. But I thought the highlight of the defense was the defensive line. I thought they played really good. Tremont Morris-Brash was all conference. He played lights out most of the year. Josh Seliskar had a really good year. Ricky Barber had a nice bounce back after being injured the previous year. Anthony Montalvo was, great for us for, stretches of the season. So I thought the D-line was really good. Lee Hunter got some really good minutes in there. TMB led the team with 6 sacks. He ends up being all conference. So I felt real good about, what the D-line did. They did not have a lot of depth. That was the thing. after the starters, some of the, I think it was there's a stat, Josh Seliskar played every single snap of every single game because UCF didn't really trust the depth behind them. So the defense had its moments. They led the team through the first half of the season, and then they kind of crapped out and fizzled out towards the end of the year. And I think it was that depth injuries that kind of showed. And, T Will maybe, mailed it in, knew he was leaving. He ended up leaving for Arkansas, at the end of the year there. But we get to promote within, which was nice. With new defensive coordinator, to start off in the Big 12. So, that was nice to promote within. I think I always like doing that as opposed to bringing in an outside guy. So that was good. Then offense, let's talk about that. Everyone was excited about the offense. The big question was who was going to be quarterback and how will they perform. JRP was the model of inconsistency. Had some amazing moments and had some bad ones. Basically, the best way to describe it, had the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. We got some epic moments out of him, some epic wins because of him. His rushing was absolutely fantastic. One of the leading rushers in the conference as a quarterback, which is obviously impressive. He led the team in rushing yards, had 862 rushing yards and 11 rushing touchdowns. But his arm was suspect. Obviously had his best year ever from a throwing standpoint because he got the most opportunity, threw for 2,500 yards, 14 touchdowns and 8 picks. So nothing really outstanding there. Keen obviously had his great moments in the 4 games that he played. And Tommy was really mostly mop-up duty. As far as the rest of the offense, I think the big story is RJ Harvey. We had every year I like to look at the breakout star. RJ Harvey was UCF's breakout star. Started in the Cincy game when he had those 2 touchdowns. Was by far UCF's most efficient running back. And this guy used to be a quarterback. Finished with 796 yards, 5 touchdowns. And also had 215 receiving yards, but, averaged nearly 7 yards per carry, despite having, a lot of carries. It wasn't like it was a guy that had 10 carries, right? He was the story of the season. Bowser was still a massive role. He had the lion's share of the carries, had 205 rushing attempts compared to RJ's 118. He had lost a step. Something was different with him. I don't know if it was the weight loss that he had going into the season. He just was not the same player. I mean, he still ended up rushing for 800 yards and was actually second on the team in rushing yards. But his rushing average dipped to under 4. He had 3.9 yards per carry, had very few long runs like he did that first year. But he was a touchdown machine. He ended up with 16 touchdowns. That was one of the most touchdowns in UCF history for a single season. He had 16. I think I'm going to check right now. Rushing touchdowns for a single season. He was second all time, only behind Kevin Smith's 29. So Latavius Murray had 15, was second. Isaiah Bowser broke his record. So from that standpoint, I mean, it's still production, right? I mean, that's 16 touchdowns right there. That's a lot of points. That was very helpful. I mean, obviously a lot were on short and goal line plays, but those were necessary. But RJ Harvey was absolutely the breakout star of the season. There's no question about it. Then, you had Johnny Richardson, who I'm actually surprised didn't transfer. His role was dramatically reduced. He only ended up with 54 rushing attempts, 370 yards, and 0 touchdowns. But once again, he was averaging 6.9 yards per carry. Out of the running backs, that was the highest amount, more than Harvey, more than Bowser, more than Plumlee. So he was efficient when he got the ball. He just didn't get the ball that often. And he did also have 122 yards through the air and a receiving touchdown. When he gets the ball, he's dynamic with it. So, we were fortunate to have 3 really good running backs this year, but obviously RJ Harvey got the lion's share. Then you talk about, receiving. Javon Baker was obviously the breakout player of the year, the one of the bigger stories there. He transfers in from Alabama at the last second almost. Him and Kobe Hudson are great friends. Kobe got him to come. And you saw it right from week 1 against South Carolina State. He was special right off the bat. Had an 80-yard game in his first ever really game with a lot of minutes because he didn't play at Alabama that much. Was dynamic. He ends up leading the team with 796 yards and 5 touchdowns. And then, there's Ryan O'Keefe, who still led the team in receptions with 73, also had 5 touchdowns and 725 yards. And then, of course, O'Keefe also had 222 rushing yards because he was kind of a jack of all trades. So O'Keefe was still really good. He just wasn't the same as the previous year. I think JRP and him didn't have a great connection. His yards per catch average dipped to 9.9 after being in the teens the last couple of years. His last year was clearly his breakout year. This year was still good. He was obviously our leading catcher in terms of receptions. Just didn't feel quite the same as the previous year. Maybe that was the more depth at receiver, not forcing it to him as much. Was still good, just didn't feel like he was as dynamic. Javon Baker was clearly the Knights' go-to number one receiver. There's no question about that. But also UCF had some trouble in the air, so I don't know if it's O'Keefe's fault. Anyways, O'Keefe ends up transferring after how he was used, and I don't think he liked kind of being that jack of all trades kind of guy. Maybe wanted to be used more vertically, but that was Baker this year. And then Kobe Hudson, the Auburn transfer, actually led the team in touchdowns, had 7 receiving touchdowns, 641 yards, all career highs for him. Was third in the team in receptions with 39. So those were anchored our big 3. And then, we weren't sure who was going to be that 4th receiver. Was it going to be Amari Johnson? Was it going to be Jalen Griffin? It ended up, really being Xavier Townsend, who was named on the 2 deep from the beginning of the year, ended up having 23 receptions, which was the 4th most on the team, had 127 yards and a touchdown. So not a ton of yards or anything like that, but he was really that 4th guy that you saw. Also got some rushing opportunities as well. And of course, you had Alec Holler, who had 22 catches for 276 yards and one of the biggest touchdowns of the season, one of those memorable ones against USF. And surprisingly, Kamori Gamble the UF transfer was very underutilized. Pretty much after the first couple of weeks was out of the lineup. It was all really Holler when you talk about that tight end position. But really it was Baker, O'Keefe, and Hudson that kind of led the charge from a receiving standpoint. It didn't really use a 4th. Quan Lee didn't really play. Jalen Griffin didn't really play. It was really just Townsend and I guess, Holler at tight end. But it was good. We got our anchors now with Baker and Hudson will be back next year as the 2 leading receivers with O'Keefe out. And then at running back, obviously Bowser graduates and we're going to have RJ Harvey, Johnny Richardson, Jordan McDonald, have a bunch of guys. Then, as far as the rest of the offensive line, once again, it had shaky at points, but they do end up with 3 out of 5 that were all conference first team. They had their moments. They had some good ones. Obviously, UCF was a great rushing team with 3,300 yards. One of the leaders actually in the country in rushing yards and rushing yard average. Obviously the offensive line did their part. We can't sit there and act like the offensive line was horrible, but they had some issues with protection at times. JRP was pretty much forced to use his legs, and that was okay. It worked. But then when you saw Mikey Keene back there running for his life against Navy and at times USF, you saw that there were sometimes some issues with our offensive line. But overall, I think they played pretty well. You had Lee, you had Sam Jackson, and you had Loki Pole all, and I think he was honorable mention, and then the Virginia transfer as well, all be on an all conference team. Ryan Swoboda, and UCF did finish in the top 10 in rushing yards per game, as well as total rushing yards. So they were number 5 in total rushing yards. And so, obviously great there. It was just a passing attack that was shaky at times throughout the season. Then the other big story, you have to go to special teams, Colton Boomer. Obviously, we saw the same kicking woes with Daniel Obarski missing his first couple kicks of the year. Finally, I think it was week 3, Colton Boomer comes in and absolutely plays lights out as a true freshman. He is now our kicker of the future. He was one of the biggest stories of the year. He absolutely was lights out, deserves all the praise, and don't take that for granted. Having a reliable kicker is so important. You don't think about it until you really need it, but he ended up going 42 for 43 on extra points and 14 for 15 on field goals. Missed 1 field goal all year, and it was a 50-plus yarder, went 3 from 3 from 40 to 49 yards. He was lights out. There's no question about that. That was one of the bigger stories of the year. He's our kicker of the future. Great to see that. overall, that really kind of recaps the year. UCF finishes with 7 guys on the all conference team, including Isaiah Bowser, including Ryan O'Keefe, including the 3 or 4 offensive linemen, Jason Johnston, Tremon Morris-Brash, all make, and Devad Wilson, I think was the other one, if I'm not mistaken, all make the conference team one way or the other. So, there was definitely some great highlights of the year. UCF finishes 9-5, and now we start to focus on next season, the Big 12, our first. UCF brings in a really strong recruiting class, some transfers. UCF loses quite a few players. Obviously, Mikey Keene transferred. Isaiah Bowser graduates. Ryan O'Keefe transferred. Jeremiah Jean-Baptiste transferred. Devontae Brown transferred. And Matt Lee transferred. Those were the main ones, but UCF went real heavy on offensive line transfers, as well as wide receiver to make up for some of those losses. Probably have to, hit the portal in the next wave after the spring to shore up linebacker, to shore up defensive line, maybe even get one more wide receiver, possibly a quarterback. I don't, that's going to be one of the interesting stories going into spring, is who wins the QB battle, especially with JRP returning, but also playing baseball. So a lot of things going on with UCF world, and a lot of position battles. I'm excited to see the spring. I'm excited to see the transfers. I'm excited to see the freshmen, one of the best classes UCF has ever signed on paper. And then the last year's freshman, the rising sophomores, really excited to see, can Nakai Martinez break out, right? Can the Henderson twins break out? Jakari Henderson had a great bowl game against Duke, looked like he has a promising future. Quan Lee, Xavier Townsend, who's going to be that next guy? Jordan McDonald, Tommy Castellanos, could he win the starting QB role? So that's all going to be exciting. But that's my 2022 recap. Overall, I'd give UCF season like a B minus. We are going to have a new offensive coordinator next year, former UCF quarterback Darren Hinshaw. We're going to have a new defensive coordinator now that T-Will has left. So quite a few changes, but quite a few great returning talent. Obviously starting QB, 2 out of the 3 top receivers, 2 out of the 3 top running backs are returning. Alec Holler's returning. Our Colton Boomer's returning. Jason Johnson's returning. Linebacker Walter Yates is. Josh Seliscar, Tremon Morris-Brash. Pretty much our entire defensive line, besides Anthony Montalvo, is returning. Most of our secondary, besides obviously Brown, Hodges, and Perry. So, we got some exciting things in the works. And with that, go Knights. And thank you for tuning in to the UCF Football Updates podcast.